In the middle of a deadly Alaskan blizzard, veteran Jim Walker hears something no one should ever hear in a storm. Rex growling at the door like danger itself is calling. Then it happens. A faint, broken scream buried under the wind. Without hesitation, Jim grabs his gear and follows Rex into the whiteout. Minutes later, they find the unthinkable. An overturned snowmobile, a young rescue worker barely clinging to life, and her injured Alaskan dog standing guard in the freezing dark. Tonight, in a storm that kills without mercy, Jim and Rex aren't just fighting the cold. They're racing against time to save two strangers the mountains were ready to bury. The storm had swallowed the mountains long before sunset, burying the northern Alaska ridgelines in a curtain of white, so thick it erased distance and sound. Jim Walker, a 50-year-old U.S. veteran with a square jaw, weather-worn skin, and a short, disciplined military haircut, stood near the frosted cabin window as wind screamed against the logs like claws raking wood. Outside, the sky was the color of bruised steel, snow blowing sideways in violent sheets. The old iron stove inside crackled weakly as Jim adjusted his military cold-weather parka with its double zipper and thick wind-proof fabric. He listened for any break in the storm's roar. Rex, Jim's 5-year-old German shepherd with black and tan fur and razor-sharp alertness, paced the wooden floor in anxious circles. Rex had been trained as a canine rescue partner during Jim's service, and even in retirement the dog carried himself with disciplined vigilance. Tonight, however, something was different. Rex kept stopping at the door, ears forward, tail stiff, letting out uneasy whines. Jim knelt beside him, brushing a gloved hand along his fur. "What's got you stirred up, buddy?" Rex didn't relax. He only pressed closer to the door, muscles tense. A strange shift in the wind carried a faint sound, so thin it could have been imagined. Rex froze, barked sharply, then looked back at Jim with urgency in his eyes. Jim held his breath and listened. There it was again, a distant cry, fragile and distorted by the blizzard. Not an animal, not the wind. It was human. Jim felt that old instinct tighten inside him, the reflex of someone who had once been responsible for lives in unforgiving conditions. He grabbed his coat, boots, and gear without hesitation. He opened his emergency storage crate and pulled out his winter rescue pack. Flashlight, thermal blankets, medical kit, flare gun, extra gloves, and a compact extraction tool. He slung the pack over his shoulder, zipped the parka up to his high collar, and tightened his boots. Rex scratched urgently at the door, barking once as if giving the order. "All right, Rex. Lead the way." Jim switched on his headlamp, gripped the handle, and pushed the cabin door open. The cold slammed into him like a wall of needles. Snow blasted into their faces the moment they stepped outside. The wind shoved at Jim, forcing him to brace his legs with each step. The familiar dark spruces and rolling hills were nearly invisible through the storm's white fury. Rex lowered his head, sniffing aggressively, tracking something only he could sense. In the brief moments between wind gusts, Jim heard that cry again. Fainter now, but unmistakably real. He trudged through knee-deep snow, breath fogging, boots sinking heavily as the storm swallowed his footprints instantly. Descending a slope toward an old service road, Jim spotted something odd. Fresh tire tracks. The wind hadn't erased them yet, meaning the vehicle had passed through recently. But the tracks veered erratically, like a driver losing control on ice. Rex pressed his nose to the trail, then barked sharply before sprinting forward. Jim followed, shining his headlamp ahead. A shard of broken mirror glinted in his beam. The storm shook the branches above them like brittle bones. Rex suddenly stopped, growling low. Jim raised his flashlight and saw clear signs of a violent crash. A deep gouge carved into a snowbank, debris scattered across the ground, a torn backpack, a ripped jacket sleeve, a crushed thermos. Jim's pulse quickened. Whoever crashed hadn't walked away unharmed. Skid marks led down a shallow embankment. Jim slid down after Rex, boots digging into powder, his headlamp illuminated mangled metal, the remains of a vehicle half buried in snow. The SUV was a dark red rescue truck, one used by Alaska Mountain Response. The emblem on its side confirmed it. That meant the driver wasn't just any traveler. They were a rescuer, likely responding to an emergency before becoming a victim of the storm themselves. Jim forced open the warped driver's door. Cold air and the metallic scent of blood spilled out. A young woman lay slumped over the wheel, maybe late 20s. Long dark hair matted with frost and blood, light brown skin pale from shock. She was slender but fit, wearing a torn orange SAR jacket, and her left leg was pinned under the crushed dashboard. Jim touched her shoulder. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. Beneath the frost, her hazel eyes glimmered with pain. She tried to speak but only released a strained gasp. Rex whined, pressing against Jim's leg. Jim checked her breathing, shallow. She likely had a concussion, possible fractures, and severe hypothermia setting in fast. As he reached into his pack for supplies, a scratching sound came from behind the SUV. Rex barked sharply and ran toward it. Jim followed him to the back of the wreck. Curled beneath the fallen bumper was a medium-sized mixed-breed dog with golden fur, now streaked with blood from a deep gash along its side. The animal trembled violently, eyes glassy and unfocused. This must have been the rescuer's partner. "Easy, I've got you," Jim whispered. He wrapped the dog in a thermal blanket and lifted it gently. Even through gloves he could feel the animal shivering. With Rex leading, Jim returned to the woman trapped in the seat. Snow swirled violently around them. He glanced at the damaged SUV, then at the steep climb back towards the cabin, then at the woman whose life hung by a thread. Jim tightened his grip on the wounded dog and steadied himself. He had survived battlefields with fewer resources than this. He wouldn't lose them. Not tonight. With the blizzard howling like a beast around them, Jim prepared for a rescue that would push every ounce of strength he had left. Jim Walker crouched low in the blizzard as Rex whimpered beside him, urging him to hurry. The young woman's face was half buried in the snow, pale as moonlight, with strands of dark hair frozen against her skin. Jim could see her red SAR parka torn along the side, the reflective stripes barely visible under sheets of ice. Her lips were blue, trembling, as though her body was still struggling to stay alive. Jim brushed away more snow from her chest, revealing her ID patch. Maya Quinn. Rex nudged Jim's arm impatiently, glancing at the shadows behind them as if warning that time was slipping away with the storm closing in. Jim leaned closer, fingers searching carefully along Maya's neck until he found a pulse, weak but present. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, each exhale a thin plume of mist carried by the wind. Her skin was cold to the touch, the kind of cold that made the body forget how to fight. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with a slender athletic build common among SAR workers trained for long treks across difficult terrain. Jim noticed bruising along her left thigh and dried blood around a cut behind her knee where her uniform was ripped. She had fought hard before collapsing. A sudden growl made Jim shift. Standing a few feet away, partially hidden by a drift of snow, was an Alaskan husky mix. Its thick coat, white and gray, its left paw held just slightly off the ground. The dog's eyes, a striking ice blue, were full of both pain and determination. Despite the injury, the dog stood protectively over Maya, refusing to back away. Jim spoke softly. "Easy, boy. Or girl, I'm here to help." The dog let out a low whine, ears flicking back. On its collar was a metal tag, Nanook. Rex stepped beside Jim, tail low, giving the injured dog a respectful nod. Jim examined the overturned snowmobile, noticing the climbing rope cut cleanly near the rear hitch. It was not frayed, not snapped, cut. That meant Maya's crash might not have been an accident. Tools were scattered in the snow, including a cracked emergency radio, a small first aid kit torn open, and a headlamp smashed against a rock. Jim's instincts sharpened. Maya had been in trouble long before she crashed. He scanned the tree line, the falling snow forming ghostly shapes. No tracks, no sign of anyone else. Whoever had done this was long gone, or still close. He pulled Maya gently into his arms and signaled Rex to stay alert. The climb back up the slope was brutal. The storm battled every step, pushing Jim sideways as the wind screamed across the mountainside. Rex walked ahead, carving a rough path through the snow. Nanook followed beside Jim, limping but refusing to fall behind. Jim shifted Maya's weight, holding her close to his chest so her body would steal some warmth from his. She groaned faintly, her eyelids fluttering. "Stay with me," Jim muttered. "Just a little longer." Snowflakes clung to her eyelashes, melting against his jacket. The storm swallowed everything around them, turning their climb into a fight against an invisible enemy. By the time they reached the ridge near Jim's cabin, the blizzard was at its peak. Whiteout conditions reduced the world to nothing but noise and cold. Jim squinted through the wind, barely recognizing the shape of the cabin door ahead. Rex barked to guide him, the sound muffled by the storm. Jim tightened his hold on Maya, stumbling forward until his shoulder finally hit the wooden frame. He kicked the door open with his heel and stumbled inside, collapsing to his knees with Maya still cradled in his arms. The warmth from the wood stove was a shock, almost painful after the raw bite of the storm. Inside, Jim laid Maya on a thick bearskin rug by the stove. Her face was still ashen, her breathing faint. Jim quickly shed his gloves and checked her again. Her pulse was irregular, her skin dangerously cold. She had hypothermia and blood loss, and the deep bruises on her ribs told Jim she might have been struck hard before the crash. Maya's features, though fragile now, hinted at a fierce and determined young woman. Sharp cheekbones, strong brows, and a jaw shaped by stubbornness. He grabbed blankets, wrapping her carefully. Rex hovered beside her, sniffing her clothing, recognizing the faint scent of fear and exhaustion carried in the fibers. Meanwhile, Nanook limped to a corner, curling painfully onto the floor. Jim approached slowly, one hand extended. Nanook hesitated, then allowed Jim to examine the injured paw. A deep gash ran along the pad, likely from broken metal or a sharp stone during the crash. Jim cleaned it with warm water from the kettle and wrapped it using gauze from his medical kit. Nanook whimpered but didn't snap. His loyalty to Maya was stronger than his pain. Rex lay beside him quietly, offering silent reassurance. The cabin, though small, felt like a sanctuary as the storm savaged the world outside. Jim returned to Maya, gently lifting her head to check for hidden injuries. She stirred, whispering something he couldn't understand. Her voice was hoarse, shaky. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe," he said. "I've got you." Maya's eyes opened slightly, unfocused. For a moment she seemed to search his face. Then she whispered a single word. "Cut. Rope. Someone," before slipping back into unconsciousness. The warning lingered heavily in Jim's mind. Someone had sabotaged her. Someone had left her out there to die. Jim looked toward the storm outside, jaw tightening with cold resolve. He adjusted the blankets around Maya and added another log to the fire, watching the flames rise. The warmth finally started to return some color to her cheeks. Outside, the blizzard battered the cabin like a living beast. But inside, the four of them were bound by fragile hope. Jim knelt by the window, staring into the darkness, trying to piece together what Maya's broken sentence meant. The mountains of Alaska didn't give second chances. If someone had tried to kill her, they might not be done yet. As Rex rested his head on Jim's knee, Jim made a silent promise: to protect Maya and uncover the truth buried beneath the snow. Maya Quinn woke to the popping sound of firewood and the warm glow of the cabin's lantern light flickering against the wooden walls. The last thing she remembered was snow, cold, and fear. Now she was wrapped in thick blankets on a bearskin rug, her injured leg bandaged with neat precision. Jim Walker sat close by, his rugged face softened by concern, the gray in his short military-cut hair catching the light. His posture remained disciplined, even relaxed, like a soldier who never fully stopped assessing threats. Rex lay curled beside Maya, his black and tan coat shimmering in the firelight, while Nanook rested on a folded blanket near the stove, breathing steadily. Maya tried to sit up, wincing as pain shot down her bruised ribs. Jim steadied her with a firm hand. Even in her weakened state, her features carried strength. Sharp brows, determined eyes, dark hair matted but still striking against her pale skin. "You're safe," Jim said quietly. "Storm's still out there, but you're inside now." Maya swallowed hard, memories returning in broken flashes. "The signal," she whispered. "The emergency beacon. It went dark. The whole valley lost comms." Jim leaned closer. "What happened, Maya?" She looked up, fear flickering behind exhaustion. "Someone shut the relay station down." She explained that earlier that day she had been assigned to check the remote radio relay tower perched on a narrow ridge overlooking the valley, a structure vital for connecting distress calls from the wilderness back to the main SR hub. "It wasn't a malfunction," Maya said. "I saw the panel. Someone cut power deliberately, not smashed, not weather damage, clean-cut lines." Her voice trembled. "When I tried to restart the signal, the system was locked out from inside, like someone who knew the codes disabled it." Jim felt a cold chill crawl up his spine, unrelated to the storm. Disabled comms meant no rescue teams, no emergency alerts, an entire valley deaf and blind. Jim stood, pulling on his heavy military parka. "If someone crippled the relay, they didn't want anyone calling for help," he said, thinking aloud. "And if they're still in this valley—" His jaw tightened. Years of battlefield instinct hummed. Rex rose instantly, mirroring his alertness. Maya tried to push herself up, but Jim shook his head. "You're not going anywhere until you can walk without collapsing." Nanook limped to Maya's side, resting his head gently on her hand. She stroked his thick, white-gray fur, drawing strength from her loyal companion. "There's more," she whispered. "When I left the relay station, I felt watched." Jim's eyes narrowed. "Describe it." Maya closed her eyes, recalling the moment. "Footprints, not mine, heavy, deep ones. Someone had been there long before I arrived. And when I left, I heard metal scraping, like someone moving equipment just out of sight." Jim felt a sinking weight settle in his chest. Someone sabotaged the communications network and tried to ensure Maya never returned to report it. The cut rope on her snowmobile now made chilling sense. This wasn't random. It was deliberate. Someone dangerous was out there. Jim grabbed his flashlight and opened the cabin door to check the perimeter, the blizzard howling like a living creature beyond the threshold. Stepping outside, Jim scanned the darkness, watching snow whip past in chaotic streaks. The storm had softened slightly, but visibility remained poor. He inspected the snow near the cabin, noting the deep prints from his earlier return, but also a faint track leading toward the tree line that wasn't his. A wide boot print, heavier than Maya's or his own, partially filled with new snow, likely from earlier before the storm intensified. Jim crouched, his breath fogging in the air, studying the angle. Whoever made this track moved with purpose, not panic. Rex sniffed the print and growled softly. Jim's hardened eyes followed the trail into the trees. Inside, Maya tried to steady her breathing as she watched the door Jim had vanished through. She rubbed her temples, trying to piece together more details from the relay station. She remembered the locked interface screen, the error code flashing red, and paper logs strewn across the floor as though someone had been searching for something. The thought made her shiver. What could someone possibly want from a remote emergency relay system? Funding documents? Maps? Access frequencies? None of that justified sabotaging an entire valley's lifeline. She looked down at Nanook. His blue eyes studied her anxiously, mirroring her fear. "It wasn't random, boy," she whispered. "Someone wanted us isolated." Jim pushed back through the door, snow dusting his shoulders. He shook it off and locked the cabin firmly. "We're not alone out here," he said, voice low. "There's a second trail heading toward the North Ridge." Maya's face paled. "North Ridge?" she echoed. "That leads back to the relay tower." Jim nodded grimly. "Whoever sabotaged it might return to finish whatever they started." Maya's instincts tightened. Someone with knowledge of SAR operations, someone familiar with mountain routes. "Jim, that station logs distress signals, and it logs coordinates." Jim's expression hardened. "So someone could see who called for help? And where?" Rex barked sharply, sensing the rising tension. Jim knelt beside Maya again. "Can you remember anything else? Anything about the person? Their gear? Footsteps?" She closed her eyes. "They were careful, but I remember something metallic, like a clasp hitting a railing. And footprints. Large, deep, possibly a man wearing insulated mountaineering boots." Jim nodded. "Experienced, then. Someone who knows the terrain." Maya inhaled shakily. "Jim, they didn't want me alive." She looked at her bandaged leg. "Cut rope. Doesn't lie." Jim rested a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe here, I promise." But he knew promises meant little in an Alaska storm. As the fire crackled behind them, Jim stood again, staring out the frosted window. The storm outside masked every sound, turning the mountains into a world of shadows. He knew the relay station was the only place to find answers, and maybe clues to whoever hunted Maya. He tightened the straps on his parka and grabbed his snow gear. Rex rose with him instantly, eyes bright and ready. Maya reached out. "Jim, wait. Don't go alone. If that person is still there—" Jim shook his head. "Someone has to check it before more snow covers the evidence." He paused. "I'll be careful." Nanook lifted his head and let out a soft, worried howl. Jim reached down and gently stroked the dog's thick fur. "Take care of her," he murmured. "Both of you." As he stepped outside once more, the blizzard's roar swallowed him. Rex stayed glued to his side, the loyal shadow he'd trusted through bullets, fire, and now ice. The cabin door shut behind them, leaving Maya and Nanook in the warm, dim glow, listening to the storm as it towered over the mountains. And somewhere out there in the white void, a saboteur moved unseen, ready to return to the disabled relay station that held secrets someone would kill to protect. The storm finally eased into a fragile silence, allowing the sharp cold of Alaska to settle over the mountains. Jim Walker stepped outside, his breath turning into white haze as he surveyed the jagged ridges above. At 50, Jim moved with the calm certainty of a man shaped by war and wilderness. Behind him, Maya Quinn leaned against the cabin door frame, wrapped in the thick SAR coat Jim had given her. Her pale cheeks were bruised, and her long dark hair was tucked beneath a wool beanie. Rex stood at Jim's heel, posture disciplined, while Nanook limped out behind Maya, refusing to stay behind despite his injured leg. The repeater tower at the summit was their only chance to restore communication. Maya checked her toolkit, the strap crossing her slim frame as she steadied her breathing. Despite the pain etched in her expression, her hazel eyes were fiercely resolute. She described the climb: steep ice walls, narrow ridges, and unpredictable winds that could toss hikers into ravines. Jim listened with the seriousness of a former Marine who understood terrain like a second language. Rex sniffed the frozen wind, sensing unseen danger. Jim tightened Maya's harness, hands steady, his quiet strength offering reassurance. Nanook pressed gently against Maya's side, protective and alert. They set out just as the sky brightened to a pale Arctic blue. Snow crunched beneath their boots in sharp, rhythmic beats. Jim led the way, cutting through the deep drifts with steady precision. Maya followed closely, her slender frame moving carefully across the icy ground. Rex paced between them, his tan black fur dusted with frost. Nanook limped behind, determined and brave despite the pain. At a narrow ledge, Jim extended a hand to Maya, steadying her as the wind slammed against them. The ravine below disappeared into shadow, but Maya pushed forward, her breath trembling but her determination unbroken. Halfway up the mountainside, the wind struck again with brutal force. Ice particles cut across their faces as if nature itself were warning them away. Maya crouched and shielded Nanook when the husky slipped on the glassy rock. Jim held his stance, anchoring himself like a rooted tree while Rex braced beside him. Jim pulled Maya back to her feet, their jackets snapping in the gale. "We're close," she shouted. He nodded, but his narrowed gaze caught something unsettling near the ridge. Snow disturbed by something other than weather. Heavy, deliberate tracks. Someone had climbed ahead of them. They reached a frozen shelf, where the repeater tower rose from the snow like a metal skeleton. Maya straightened despite her injuries, her instincts honing sharply at the sight. Nanook barked once, a low warning. Jim raised a hand for silence. Rex's hackles rose as he sniffed the air. Jim examined the ground and saw the boot prints more clearly, deep and precise. "Not SAR," Maya said quietly, her brows furrowed. "Whoever it was didn't want to be found." Jim's jaw tightened. The footprints meant the sabotage wasn't accidental. Someone wanted the valley blind. The damage to the repeater was unmistakable. A heavy tarp had been tied over the air vents, forcing the system to overheat. A sheet of thick metal had been jammed into the antenna's joint to block its signal path. Jim brushed frost off the edges and traced the clean tool marks. "This was deliberate," he said. Maya cleared snow from the control panel, revealing torn wires and deep pry marks. Anger burned through her exhaustion. They knew exactly what to hit. Rex circled the tower, nose raised high, tracking an unfamiliar scent. Nanook sat beside Maya, watchful and tense. Maya opened the panel and gently touched the damaged circuits. Some were melted, but others could be repaired. She removed her gloves, revealing frostbitten knuckles and slender fingers trembling from cold. Jim stood guard behind her, scanning the jagged horizons for movement. His eyes were sharp, trained by years of combat in hostile landscapes. Rex moved like a soldier, back and forth, alert and silent. Nanook remained close to Maya, whining when she winced in pain. I can bypass most of it, she said breathlessly. Jim responded, Do it fast, we're exposed. As Maya worked, the mountain grew unnervingly still. The wind quieted to a strange, heavy silence. Jim stepped several feet away, scanning the ridge. A faint crunch echoed. Snow shifting, but not by weather. Rex's body snapped into alertness, eyes fixed on the ridge. Jim raised his hand. A shadow slipped behind a boulder. The movement was human, controlled, cautious, the kind of presence that watched without wanting to be seen. Jim repositioned himself, shielding Maya. Nanook growled softly, fur bristling. We're not alone, Jim whispered, barely moving his lips. The tower flickered to life with a low hum. Maya exhaled sharply as steady green lights blinked across the panel. She stood unsteadily, rubbing her cold hands together. Done. The signal's back. Jim didn't look at the tower. His eyes remained locked on the ridge. We leave now, he said. Maya felt fear tighten her stomach, but nodded. She packed her tools quickly while Jim backed toward her, never lowering his guard. Rex stayed pressed to Jim's side. Nanook remained near Maya. The footprints near the tower were fresh. Too fresh. The saboteur had likely seen everything. Jim took the lead again, guiding them toward the descent path. Maya leaned heavily on her ice axe, her slim body trembling from exhaustion and cold. Rex moved like a shadow beside Jim, ears pinned forward. Nanook stayed close to Maya, despite the pain in his injured leg. When they reached the ridge, Jim scanned the mountainside once more. The ridge where he had seen the shadow was empty. Just snow, rock, and wind. But then a distant metallic sound drifted through the air, the unmistakable scrape of a boot against steel. Maya shivered. The repeater was fixed, but something far more dangerous had awakened. The descent from the tower had barely begun when Jim Walker stopped abruptly. The shift in the air, the strange metallic echo he'd heard earlier, now sharpened into something unmistakable. Danger. The 50-year-old veteran lowered his center of gravity, his breath steady despite the cold burning his lungs. His rugged face hardened, the lines of age carved into stone. Behind him, Maya Quinn wavered on her ice axe, her slender frame struggling against fatigue. Her bruised cheeks and pale skin stood out against the red of the SAR jacket she wore. Rex froze beside Jim, fur bristling. Nanook limped to Maya's side, tail low. Jim raised a clenched fist. Silence. That gesture was enough. Someone was watching them. A crack split the air. Snow burst off the rock inches from Jim's head. The shot echoed down the mountainside. Maya flinched violently, nearly losing her footing. Jim pushed her down behind a frozen ledge. Marksman, Jim muttered, studying the angle. The shot was precise. Clean. Not a panicked strike, a professional. Maya tried to steady her breathing, her dark eyes wide with fear. Rex crouched low, ready, muscles coiled. Nanook growled softly, leaning protectively against Maya. Jim spotted the muzzle flash, across the ravine, half hidden behind a jagged spine of rock. A man was lying prone, wearing dark snow gear, blending with the terrain, and he was waiting for a second shot. Jim scanned the ridge, analyzing the terrain the way he had on countless Marine deployments. The marksman had height advantage, wind cover, and a narrow gap that limited approaches. Jim whispered, "He's not here to scare us. He's here to finish what he started." Maya's breath hitched. "The saboteur?" Jim nodded grimly. "Or someone hired by him." The stranger's face was obscured by a black balaclava, but his posture revealed a trained shooter. Steady elbows, slow breathing, perfect alignment behind a long rifle mounted on a bipod. Jim needed to draw the marksman's attention away from Maya, who was still dangerously exposed. Another shot cracked the air, hitting the ledge dangerously close to Maya's boots. Jim grabbed a loose chunk of ice and flung it down the slope, letting it shatter loudly. The marksman adjusted instantly, firing toward the noise. "Good," Jim whispered. "He reacts fast. I can use that." Jim pointed to Rex, whispering commands with marine precision. Rex lowered his head and moved left along the ridge in a silent arc. The German Shepherd's training made him nearly invisible against the snow as he stalked through sparse brush. Maya watched Rex go, her hands trembling. "Be careful," she whispered. Jim gave her a reassuring look. "He knows what he's doing." Jim slid along the slope to the right, angling toward a lower rock formation that provided minimal cover. Another bullet slammed into the snow where Jim had been a second earlier. The shooter tracked him aggressively, ignoring Maya and Nanuko completely. Jim's decoy plan was working. Maya, clutching her toolkit, forced herself to breathe slowly. She scanned the tower's portable control relay strapped to her belt. It needed a full restart sequence to stabilize. She had minutes, maybe less. Maya forced herself up, ducking behind a boulder as she began the sequence. Her frostbitten fingers moved with trained precision. Nanook pressed close to her, sensing her fear. Rex reached his position behind a low ridge opposite the shooter's blind spot. The German Shepherd crouched, observing Jim for the next signal. Jim raised 2 fingers, then swept his hand down. Rex burst forward through the snow, sending up a spray of white. The marksman snapped toward the sound. A shot rang out. The bullet hit a rock near Rex, but the dog was already diving behind another outcrop. Jim used the distraction to sprint toward a higher ledge. His boots slammed into the ice with practiced confidence despite the slope. The marksman realized too late. Jim had vanished from his line of sight. Maya forced her shaking hands through the last connections. The relay hummed faintly. "Come on, come on," she whispered. Her pale lips tightened as she rewired the final circuit. The panel lights flickered. Green, then blue, then solid green again. "Yes," she gasped. Nanook barked, tail lifting slightly despite his injured leg. The connection was live. The emergency network was rebooting. Maya activated the distress ping, sending a signal rippling across miles of frozen wilderness. Far below the valley, emergency repeaters lit up one by one. The rescue teams would see it. But the marksman wouldn't let her walk away alive. Jim reached the top of the ridge above the marksman, moving like a ghost. He studied the shooter from behind. Broad shoulders, muscular build, black tactical snow jacket, efficient movements. A professional mercenary. Jim lowered his stance. One mistake, a slip on the ice, a crunch too loud, and the man would whip around with a perfect headshot. Jim waited for the wind. When a strong gust whistled through the rocks, he moved, quiet, controlled, deadly. He closed the distance, boots gripping the slope with expert precision. The marksman adjusted his rifle, preparing another shot toward Maya's location. His finger tightened. Jim acted. In a single motion, Jim lunged forward, grabbing the shooter's rifle and wrenching it sideways. The marksman reacted instantly, swinging an elbow toward Jim's jaw. Jim blocked it, driving his knee into the man's ribs. They tumbled in the snow, fighting for leverage. The marksman was fast, shockingly so. His eyes, visible behind the balaclava, were cold and calculating. He swung a combat knife from his sleeve. Jim barely dodged the slash. "Trained," Jim muttered under his breath. "Figures." The mercenary punched at Jim's throat, but Jim twisted, slamming the man's wrist into the ice, forcing the knife free. Rex sprinted up the slope, toward Jim's signal, barking sharply as he approached. The marksman tried to recover the rifle, but Jim kicked it away. The man swung again, but Jim caught him by the coat, slammed him into a boulder, and pinned him down using Marine close-quarters technique. Knee on the shoulder joint, one arm locked, weight shifted to break balance. Rex growled, baring his teeth inches from the shooter's face. The marksman stopped resisting. Jim pulled off the balaclava. The man was in his late 30s, square jaw, military buzz cut, scar over his right eyebrow, and a coldness that spoke of long years spent doing violence for money. A mercenary, and not a cheap one. Jim forced the man's hands behind his back, using a zip tie from his belt. "Who sent you?" The shooter smirked, lips cracked from cold. "You'll find out soon enough." Jim didn't flinch. "Wrong answer." He dragged the mercenary downhill toward Maya, who was trembling but alive, clutching the rebooted relay. Lights blinked across the valley. Rescue teams had received the signal. Maya exhaled in relief. "It worked, Jim, it really worked." Jim nodded, pushing the restrained shooter ahead of him. Rex stood guard behind the man, teeth exposed. Nanook limped beside Maya, tail moving faintly. Far below, faint helicopter rotors echoed through the valley. Maya looked at Jim with exhausted hope. "They're coming." Jim nodded once, his breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Yeah, and now we find out who wanted this valley blind." He tightened his grip on the mercenary's shoulder. The man only smiled through split lips. "You're already too late." Jim exchanged a look with Maya. Fear, determination, and a truth they both felt. This wasn't over. Not even close. The distant rumble of helicopter rotors grew louder as dawn broke across the Alaskan mountains. The sky shifted from a bruised violet to a pale, icy blue, and the first rays of sunlight glinted off the snow-covered peaks. Jim Walker stood outside the cabin, his breath thick in the cold air, watching the rescue aircraft cut through the clouds. The 50-year-old veteran carried himself with quiet steadiness, his rugged face lined with exhaustion, but also a firm sense of resolve. Inside the cabin, Maya Quinn lay bundled in blankets, her slender frame still trembling from exposure, her dark hair falling over pale cheeks bruised from the fall. Rex sat by the door, ears high, tail still. Nanook lay pressed against Maya's side, refusing to leave her even for a moment. The helicopter touched down on a cleared patch of snow, its blades kicking up a swirling storm of white powder. 2 paramedics jumped out, followed by a state police officer in his late 40s, named Officer Glenn Porter. Porter was tall, slightly heavyset, with a thick brown mustache peppered with gray, and a face hardened by years patrolling remote communities. His uniform jacket bore the insignia of the Alaska State Troopers. Jim stepped forward to greet him, offering a brief nod. Porter shook Jim's hand firmly. "Walker, we got your signal. Where's the girl?" Jim pointed toward the cabin. "Inside, hypothermia, severe bruising, but alive." Porter's stern expression softened. "Let's get her out." Inside, the paramedics carefully lifted Maya onto a stretcher. Maya was conscious but faint, her hazel eyes glassy with exhaustion and pain. "You're going to be all right," Jim said quietly, his deep voice steady. She managed a tired smile. "Only because of you," she whispered. Nanook tried to climb onto the stretcher, whining softly. One paramedic chuckled. "Easy there, big guy. She's coming with us." Maya reached out to stroke Nanook's head. "He stays." The paramedics glanced at Porter, who nodded. "Fine. The dog goes." Nanook settled beside the stretcher, his injured leg trembling but his posture firm. Rex remained near Jim, watching every movement with sharp eyes. Outside, Porter examined the zip-tied mercenary Jim had captured on the mountain. The man sat in the snow with his hands bound and a bloody scrape across his cheek, the result of their earlier struggle. Porter frowned at the rifle lying nearby, a high-grade weapon not typically found in civilian hands. "You did this by yourself?" Porter asked. Jim grunted. "He was going after Maya, and he wasn't working alone." Porter crouched, inspecting the man's tactical jacket. "Professional gear? Expensive. Someone paid well for this." The mercenary lifted his head slightly, giving Jim a cold smirk. Porter stood. "We'll take him in for questioning, but something tells me we're just scratching the surface." As Maya was loaded into the helicopter, Jim helped secure Nanook beside her. Maya reached out and squeezed Jim's hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't. Let this be for nothing." Jim nodded once, firm, steady. The helicopter lifted off, sending a blast of icy wind across the clearing. Jim shielded his face as it rose into the sky, carrying Maya and Nanook toward safety. Rex leaned against Jim's leg, sensing his concern. When the aircraft disappeared beyond the ridge, silence settled over the cabin once again. Porter approached, his breath fogging in the cold. "Walker, I need your statement, and I need to see the tower." Jim nodded. "Let's go." The hike back to the repeater tower was grueling, even with the storm now cleared. Porter struggled to keep up, his heavy boots slipping on the ice. "You make this climb often?" he panted. Jim shrugged. "Only when someone tries to kill people on it." Rex trotted ahead, sniffing every few feet. When they reached the tower, Porter examined the sabotage, the tarp choking air intake vents, the metal sheet blocking the antenna, wires cut with precision. Porter whistled low. "This isn't random vandalism." Jim crossed his arms. "No, this was meant to blind the valley." Porter removed a notepad from his jacket. "Question is, why? And who paid for it?" Porter crouched to inspect footprints left behind. The mercenaries' tracks matched the gear prints they found near the sabotaged panel. But beside them were another pair, wider, with a distinct patch pattern. Jim knelt, brushing snow aside. "Another person was here, not the shooter. Heavy boots, thick tread, that's mining footwear." Porter's eyes narrowed. "Mining? That makes a disturbing kind of sense." He stood slowly, looking across the valley. "We've had reports the past year of a copper theft ring. Professional scrappers. They strip remote telecommunication stations for copper wire, worth thousands." Jim exhaled slowly. "And they cut the signal to buy themselves time." They started back toward the cabin. Porter explained, "The theft ring usually avoids populated areas. But with storms like these, cutting emergency signals makes it impossible for rescue teams to respond. They can work for hours without anyone knowing." Jim's jaw clenched. That could have cost Maya her life. Porter nodded grimly. "And probably others too." Jim felt anger stirred deep within him, not the hot, uncontrolled kind, but the cold, steady rage of a man who had seen good people die because someone else wanted to make a quick profit. Rex sensed the shift in Jim's mood, pressing against his leg as they walked. Back at the cabin, additional officers arrived by snowmobile. Porter briefed them as they loaded the mercenary onto a sled for transport. One of the officers, a younger man with sandy blonde hair and a nervous smile, approached Jim. "Sir, the EMTs said the girl is stable. She'll make it." Jim nodded. "Good," the officer added. "And the dog, too." Jim allowed a small smile to break through the stern lines of his face. "Even better." Rex sat beside Jim, tail moving slightly for the first time since the morning. The officers secured the perimeter, collecting evidence, taking photographs, and marking footprints. As the sun climbed higher, painting the mountains in gold, Porter approached Jim with a final update. The mercenary is refusing to talk, but his gear and the way he handled that rifle. This wasn't his first job. Someone rich is behind him. Jim folded his arms, staring out toward the distant ridge. Then you'll need help. Porter raised an eyebrow. You volunteering? Jim looked at Rex. Rex looked back, ears twitching. Jim returned his gaze to Porter. If someone is willing to kill to keep their operation hidden, they won't stop at one attempt. Porter considered this, then extended his hand. Welcome to the fight, Walker. Jim shook his hand firmly. As officers mounted their snowmobiles and engines roared to life, Jim stood quietly in the clearing, watching the mountains where the danger had come from. The cold wind brushed against his face, but it no longer felt threatening. It felt like a warning. Rex stood tall beside him, eyes fixed on the same ridge. Jim took a slow breath, the way he did before every battle. Come on, buddy, he murmured. We're not done yet. Together they turned back toward the cabin, two silhouettes in the vast Alaskan wilderness, preparing for whatever storm would come next. A month later, the brutal winter storms began to loosen their grip on the Alaskan wilderness. Snow still blanketed the valleys in thick layers, but the sun returned earlier each morning, casting long golden beams across Anchorage's quiet streets. Jim Walker stood outside the Alaska SR Medical Building, hands deep in the pockets of his green military cold-weather jacket. At 50, Jim looked the same, rugged, solid, carrying himself with the steady calm of a man who had faced both war and wilderness. But his eyes softened when he saw Maya Quinn step out of the building for the first time without assistance. She looked healthier now, her slender frame no longer shaking from cold or pain, her pale skin warmed by the spring sun, her long black hair tied neatly behind her head. Maya walked toward him with confident but gentle steps, Nanook trotting proudly beside her. The Alaskan dog had fully recovered, his once bandaged leg now strong, his thick white and gray fur gleaming in the sunlight. Maya wore her fresh SAR uniform, red and black with reflective patches, fitting her tall, lean figure perfectly. She looked different, not just recovered, but stronger, as if surviving the mountain had carved deeper resolve into her. Jim greeted her with a nod. Rex, the 5-year-old German shepherd, sat at Jim's side, tail sweeping the ground once in recognition. Maya kneeled and wrapped her arms around Rex, who accepted the hug with a gentle rumble in his chest. Inside the SAR headquarters, staff members moved in and out of offices, many nodding respectfully toward Jim. News of the incident had spread across Alaska. A former Marine had saved a young rescue worker from certain death, fought a hired marksman on an icy ridge, and restored communications that could have saved dozens more. Maya guided Jim into a small office decorated with maps of mountain ranges and pinned rescue routes. On the desk lay a small silver badge engraved with the symbol of Alaska SAR. Maya picked it up with steady hands. "I've been waiting to give you this," she said softly. Jim raised an eyebrow. "I'm not SAR." Maya smiled gently. "You acted like one." She stepped closer and pinned the badge onto Jim's jacket. Her hazel eyes glimmered with gratitude and something deeper. Respect, admiration, perhaps something unspoken that neither of them dared define. "Alaska owes you," she whispered. Jim looked down at the badge, turning it slightly so the sunlight caught its edges. "I didn't do it for Alaska," he said in his low, steady voice. "I did it because you were out there." Maya inhaled sharply, touched but composed. Nanook brushed against her leg, as if urging her to keep her balance emotionally as well as physically. Jim rested a hand on Rex's head, grounding himself. Later that afternoon, they walked along the Anchorage coastal trail. The snow was melting, revealing patches of brown grass beneath. The ocean lay frozen in sections, shimmering like shattered glass. Families passed by, bundled in coats, unaware of the quiet bond forming between two people who had survived death together. Jim and Maya spoke about the rescue operation that would resume soon. Maya, now fully reinstated, would train new SAR recruits. Jim listened, his posture relaxed, though his gaze remained attentive. She described her new perspective, how nearly dying had sharpened her awareness of every detail, every risk, every sign on the wind. Jim nodded knowingly. "Survival changes you," he said, "but it also reveals who you are." Maya looked at him with a small, grateful smile. Anchorage Airport was quieter than usual when the time came for their farewell. Spring sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows, illuminating travelers moving on with their lives. Jim, dressed in his cold-weather parka, carried only a small duffel bag. He always traveled light. Rex sat by his left leg, ears perked, eyes shifting between the crowds and Maya. Maya arrived with Nanook at her side, both looking ready for the field again. She wore her SR jacket zipped halfway, revealing a black thermal shirt underneath. Her long hair fell over her shoulders now, softening her usually professional appearance. Jim noticed but said nothing. They walked together to the security line, neither speaking for a moment, the weight of shared experience hanging gently between them. Maya finally broke the silence. "I know you hate goodbyes," she said. Jim exhaled, almost smiling. "Not true. I just prefer, see you later." She stepped closer, looking up at him. "Then, see you later." She reached into her pocket and handed him a sealed envelope. "Open this when you're back in Oregon." Jim accepted it without question, slipping it into his jacket. Nanook pressed his muzzle into Jim's hand, and Jim knelt to rub the dog's thick fur. "Take care of her," he murmured. Nanook responded with a soft bark. Rex nudged Maya's leg gently, earning a bright smile from her. She crouched to hug him again, holding onto his thick neck for a moment longer than before. "You saved me too," she whispered. Rex's dark eyes softened, and he licked her gloved hand. Jim watched them, his expression unreadable but warm. Maya stood and looked at Jim with a mix of gratitude, affection, and quiet sadness. "You'll come back, right?" Jim shrugged slightly. "If Alaska needs us, we'll be here." Rex gave a short bark, as if agreeing. The final boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Jim took a step back, the terminal's light casting a golden glow across his face. "Stay safe out there," he said. Maya nodded. "You too, Jim." She reached out and squeezed his forearm lightly, a gesture full of unspoken meaning. He returned the gesture with a steady grip. Then he turned, walking toward the gate with Rex trotting beside him, the badge on his jacket catching the morning sun. Maya watched them until they disappeared. Around the corner, her heart full, yet calm. Alaska had brought them together. The mountains had tested them. And fate, whatever form it took, would decide when their paths crossed again. As Jim boarded the small plane, he took one last look at the vast, snow-tipped horizon through the window. Something about Alaska lingered in him. The danger, the silence, the beauty, and the people who fought to protect it. Rex curled at his feet, settling with a soft sigh. Jim rested a hand on the dog's back. "We'll be back," he murmured. And when the plane lifted into the sky, the rising sun painted the land below in bright gold, signaling the end of one chapter and the quiet promise of another. In life, miracles don't always arrive with thunder or bright light. Sometimes they come quietly, in the form of a veteran who refuses to walk away, a loyal dog who senses danger before anyone else, or a stranger who shows up exactly when God sends them. Jim, Rex, Maya, and Nanook remind us that even in the darkest storm, God never leaves us stranded. He guides our steps, protects our hearts, and places the right people on our path at the perfect moment. If this story touched your heart, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories of hope and courage. And tonight, I pray that God covers you with His protection, leads you through every storm, and sends you the strength you've been praying for. If you believe His miracles are real, type Amen in the comments.